This is the fifth video in the Introduction to Simio Animation module, and in this video we'll cover four basic topics: animating cues, GIS map backgrounds, creating 3D symbols, and movable resources. For animating cues, we'll spend a little bit of time and we'll do some demonstration. For the last three, though, we're going to just talk at a very high level and provide some information on how you can look at these further if they're particularly interesting for your modeling project. The first thing that we'll cover here is animating cues, and we're going to use the source server sync model that we've used in all the videos in this module. Again, if you haven't saved this model, you simply place a source, a server, a sync, connect them up with paths, and then add the default entity, and we've left all the properties the same. So the one thing I'm going to change for doing the cues is I want to be able to create or build up a cue. So I'm going to go in the server and I'm simply going to increase the processing time. So I'm going to go from 0.1, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. So I've in essence doubled the processing time, doubled the average processing time, so that I can create an input cue so that we can talk about how to animate the different cues. So now when we run the model, again, because we've effectively doubled the processing time, we're going to expect to see a cue build up here for the input buffer, and that's really what we're after, so we can look at different options for animating the cues. The first thing we'll talk about is the first two things, the concept of detached cues and attached cues. Attached cues are, as you would expect, attached to an object in the facility window. In a detached cue, we simply draw on the facility window without attaching to a particular object. So let's go back to our standard model, and I'm going to go to the animation ribbon, and we have an option here for detached cue. And so to draw my cue, I simply select that, and then I use the left click to draw it so I can have multiple segments here, and then the right click to end it. And so we have the cue, the animation of the cue here, and so what I need to specify is the cue state that I want to animate. So I can simply select, and because this is not attached to any object, Simio is going to give me a drop-down box that has all of the cue states in the current model. And so we would animate it, we would just select one of those. So what I'm going to do is then jump into the attaching to an object version. And so the only difference here is that when I select the object and click on the draw cue, now I have a drop down, so I have the cue states that are specific to this object. And so what I want to animate is the input buffer contents for server 1. So I'm just going to select that and click right here like that and just create that. Again, note that I could have done the exact same thing by going to the animation and doing a detached cue, and so I'll draw that same cue here. Oops, let me get this guy, and then end it, and then just selecting that cue state. So I could go down and click server 1, input buffer, I selected the output buffer, input buffer, contents right there. And so now I have three versions of the same buffer, and so, or the same cue. And so we run for a little bit and let some entities build up. Remember, we increased that processing time, so we're seeing the cue. And so now we can see the cue state associated with the server 1 in the animation for server 1 object, in the attached cue to server 1, and in the detached cue. And so these all three show this same Simio expression of server1.inputBuffer.contents, server 1, in this case it's attached, inputBuffer.contents, and then finally here the attached cue for the default object. So the final two things we'll look at for animated cues, we saw briefly drawing multi-segment cue previously, but we can also change the way the entities are oriented in the cue if we want to improve or animate a particular aspect of a system. So I'm going to stop my model here, and since I'm animating, I have three versions of the same thing, I'm simply going to delete the non-attached one or detached cue, and then I'm going to go back to the attached one, and I'm going to run this for a little bit, and I'm going to look at these options up here for how entities are displayed in the queue. So let's have a few entities in the queue. There we go. That looks like a good number. And you can see the default version that I have here is inline, and so this lets me specify how I want entities to appear based on how I place the vertices. So notice I clicked here, and then I clicked here, and then I right-clicked to end it, and so it's starting from this point, the first point that I clicked. I can also use the none, and so that's simply going to animate going forward from the first click point to the end click point, and so there's essentially no orientation. I can also use a point orientation. So again, I have my cue selected, I have a point orientation, and we see now that we can orient the points, and that each segment in the queue represents a single entity. So it's not a particular length, but it's the number of entities. So let me go back in here. If I can get this guy, if I can grab that point and move it a little bit closer, then I can go in and add a vertex, because we know this queue has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So let's go ahead and add another vertex. So let's add these. Add a vertex, and so you can see how easy it is to add and remove vertices. And for the point oriented, then I just have a single orientation, so all of the entities in the queue are going to point the same direction. I can also do an oriented point queue, and so in this case I can orient each individual location. If I can click the queue here, let me zoom in a little bit, I can orient each particular one individually, and so I can have them all pointing in a different direction. And so finally I have an option to keep in place, and so if I have a keep in place, you can see that when an entity leaves the queue, its place in the queue, the other entities don't shift, and so in the standard view, entities move forward, and if we have keep entities in place, they simply remain in the place that they were currently located before they were removed from the queue. These queue animation techniques are quite powerful and are particularly useful if you're trying to model a physical buffer, and so the buffer has a specific configuration, or I'm trying to model a waiting line, like a standard serpentine waiting line. We can make the queue display in that same format, and so that turns out, as I said, to be a quite useful component of animation. Next, I'll introduce the notion of using map backgrounds and how we can use a GIS system. I'm not going to do this in Simio. This is something you should definitely try if you're interested in this type of mapping. And so basically what we would do is we would select the map view from the view ribbon, so you can see that right here, and then we can choose the world street map or world imagery that are built in. So in this case I've chosen the street map. So then I would go and say I want to set the map location, so we want to tell Simio what is it that I'd like to look at. So I can either do it by latitude, longitude, I could do it by address, I could do it by the computer's current location. So you select one of those and that locates the map. I can then set node location. So in this case we place down several different nodes, and we can place those again by address. So if you have a street map say, and I want to place nodes at particular locations, I would just use that move object to the location. I can then highlight a node pair and connect. So I could click on a node, hold down the control key, click on another node, and then when you right click, you're going to have an option to add link following map route. And so we can do that either by using a time path or using a path, which will then use the actual distance to compute the speed. And so using this type of mapping, it's really straightforward to import or to use a view of a street map, place locations in, or place objects in known locations, and then have Simio compute and place the appropriate links between those locations. So this is again something I would suggest that you stop the video and go have a quick look at. When we covered 3D objects earlier in this module, we talked about the possibility of creating 3D symbols, and so we can use a tool called SketchUp to do that. And so I'm not going to demonstrate this, but if you go to this website, you can get all the information that you need about that, and particularly if you go to products, you can see the different versions. There's a SketchUp free version that you can do for personal use, and so this lets you draw 3D objects. Also note this is by Trimble, and so when we looked at the 3D warehouse, the Trimble 3D warehouse, this is how users create those models. Or this is one way that users create those models, is you could use SketchUp, and when you do that, you have an opportunity to upload your models. So again, drawing 3D objects is an interesting topic, and so I would suggest that you should give this a quick try also. The final topic we'll cover in this video is movable resources, and this includes some concepts that we haven't really talked about in detail, so I'm really just going to demonstrate this. And what this lets us do is animate the movement of an operator, for example, that's requested to be physically present at a location before the processing can begin. So let me jump over here into my model here, and we'll just run this, and you can see what I have is two servers, and when the entity moves between servers, the operator resource, the operator worker, has to be physically present. And so what this lets us do, if we jump to 3D mode, is model the requirement of a secondary resource, but also the movement of that resource back and forth. And so, as I said for the example, this is a really nice way to model a situation where you have a single person or single operator that's required to do multiple things. And so you can see in this case I've used an animated person that we talked about earlier, an animated person symbol to model that resource. And so in future videos or in future modules, we'll actually use secondary resources and talk about this movement, and you'll be able to do a workshop so that you'll see this in much more detail. So that concludes this video.